So, what do we mean by species-rich grasslands? So essentially, we are talking about grasslands like hay meadows or floodplain grazing marsh or well-managed sort of acid grasslands, as well as many other types as well. What we're not talking about are the sort of hectares of improved intensive grassland that actually constitutes, unfortunately, most of the grassland landscape that you see out and about in the countryside. So what does that actually mean? So first of all, when we talk about this idea of improved slash modified, so improved grassland was sort of maybe a slightly old-fashioned terminology. People tend to be using the word modified instead, because improved suggests that it's sort of better and good, but actually what it means is it was improved to be more productive for farming purposes. Therefore, it was usually ploughed and reseeded with a mix of white clover and perennial ryegrass. Whereas the species-rich or semi-natural grasslands usually haven't had any of those processes, or at least haven't within the sort of last sort of 50 to 100 years. That's the ideal anyway. There are some more species-rich semi-natural grasslands that maybe have had that within a slightly shorter period, but have been able to sort of restore within that time and are starting to recover. But essentially, we're talking about sort of an open grassy habitat that's maintained by some kind of management practice, which could include grazing and cutting, or just grazing, or just cutting alone. And we'll come on to that a little bit more in detail. It's considered species rich if it has about more than 15 plant species, and that includes the grass species as well, per metre square. And that would be kind of if you were plonking a metre square kind of quadrat down and counting the different species in it, you would have 15 or more plant species. Usually there's also more than 30% of the species that are there are the wildflowers and the sedges, as opposed to all just grasses. And you can have that up to sort of 50%. So 50% grasses, 50% what we say kind of herbs or forbs. And that excludes the things like the white clover, the creeping buttercup, and what we call injurious weeds, which can be sort of the broadleaf docks and the creeping thistle and the spear thistle, which are, you know, great plants in their own right in terms of their value for nature, but they can also be a sign that maybe the management or historical management hasn't necessarily been the best for that grassland. And so if you've got a lot of those species, it's not necessarily the best condition grassland. Then also that we've got less than 10% of the cover of those things like the white clover and the ryegrass that would have been sown in if it had been modified at some point. So hopefully that's makes sense. But it's also worth remembering that some important grasslands might be less rich in wildflowers and grass species, but could be really important, particularly when we're talking about Wales, important for grassland fungi. And it's amazing how you can go to a site in the summer and it's, you know, it's a bit average when it comes to sort of species diversity of plants, but come back in the autumn and it could be covered in stunning grassland fungi like pink waxcaps or something. What we're also not talking about are the kind of ornamental meadows in sort of inverted commas that often get planted around in roundabouts or in sort of residential areas, and they get sown with an annual mix of plants, often with many non-native things. Obviously, it's visually very, very attractive, but it's not a true representation of what our traditional meadows would look like. And often these species need constant soil disturbance, being annual and usually associated with arable farming, in order to come back the next year. So they would either need completely reseeding again, or they would die back and other sort of more vigorous weeds might take over. So unfortunately, we don't have much of this species-rich grasslands sort of left now all over the UK. Most of it is that modified grassland, which is, you know, really species poor, less than 10 species, and that's including the grasses. And so these really, really species-rich grasslands are down to some sort of 1% level of our land cover in the whole of the UK. So it, you know, really is under threat. We've lost such a lot since about the 1930s. And the reason for that was the drive towards higher productivity. So essentially during the war and sort of after the war, we wanted to be able to make more of our own food in our own, on our own land, which meant sort of really driving the productivity through, which meant ploughing up all of those ancient meadows and turning them into something that was going to feed livestock or produce silage and haylage, essentially, which has multiple cuts throughout the year and just doesn't have that diversity in it, which is a real shame. So why are species rich grasslands so important? Well, essentially, they're really, really key for all of the things. As you can see, we've got that sort of Venn diagram here showing that overlap of how they're important for wildlife, important for people, and important for the climate. And essentially, that's because they provide amazing ecosystem services. So it's why they're great for wildlife and the climate in terms of flood alleviation, because they hold a lot more water than those kind of improved meadows, improved grasslands where the water will run off very quickly. The complex diversity of different plants that are there in the sward create a complex diversity of root structures and microorganisms in the soil, which means it's much, much better at capturing carbon. And there's a lot of research to back this up that suggests the more diverse a grassland is, the better at storing carbon it is. So that's, really positive. It's also really great for pollinators, and obviously we need pollinators to produce food and also just generally to support all of those food webs out there for other wildlife. So these meadows are providing that function as well. But mustn't forget how it's great for us as people, for recreation, for well-being, being out in amongst a wildflower meadow. It can do such amazing things for your mental health and your physical health. So it's really kind of integral to all of these different things, and you can see here all of the different examples. So just to kind of reiterate, really, so you've got this stunning meadow, which is brilliant for pollinators, but also that complex vegetation structure where you've got all the different plants, whether they're sort of like more sort of woody or taller and shorter areas. That's providing great homes for all sorts of other wildlife as well. So other insects like the sort of non-pollinator types, as well as reptiles and amphibians and mammals, and obviously birds as well, coming to hunt on various things. And obviously it's a place for wildflowers. And I mentioned the carbon storage and the flood alleviation. So, really all pluses for having more species rich grassland. So I thought I'd just go, it's a bit of a brief one on the kinds of management that could be involved with grasslands. But essentially, a lot of grasslands that are species rich are managed through a kind of combination of cutting and then aftermath grazing. So that kind of traditional haymaking idea. This is kind of roughly the cycle through the year of what a haymaking sort of meadow would look like. So essentially at the beginning of the year, when everything starts to growing and all your wildflowers are coming out, that's when you shut the field up and you remove any livestock that are there, and you allow those grasses and flowers to get lovely and tall and grow into perfect for your hay. And then usually around mid-July, it's got mid-July to September here. So some are cut later, but generally around the mid to end of July is the more traditional time for cutting for hay. If you tend to do it later each year, it can sometimes make the grasses a little bit too dominant, and you can lose some of that sort of floral diversity over time. But essentially that's when the cut would be taken, and they obviously let it lie for a couple of days. Tedding it just means sort of turning it over, and then they would bale it and take it away. And then afterwards, that's when they would bring animals in to do what's called aftermath grazing, and possibly a bit of harrowing to remove some of the thatch, which would stop light getting to the sort of bottom soil for all those plants coming back next year. Again, potentially grazing throughout the period between, the next growth season, but not if it gets very wet, because you don't want to be disturbing that soil too much. Otherwise, you can get all of those injurious weeds like the thistles and docks kind of taking over. But that's essentially the cycle. You can also have grasslands that are managed just through grazing. So quite often these can be sites that don't have easy access for machinery. So maybe they're kind of small remnant, difficult to kind of get from a road, potentially on slopes or any kind of other landscape features that would make machinery kind of difficult. Although there are lots more options these days with more and more accessibility to purchase or rent alpine type machinery, mini tractors or push along options. Also, floodplain meadows are often managed just for grazing, often just because they would be too wet to be taking anything off them. And the management cycle with a pasture, again, very, very similar. We just don't have that hay cut, but essentially you still try and give everything a break during that main growing period so that the wildflowers and grasses bloom. Sometimes that isn't the case and they are grazed continually. However, they are normally such light level of grazing that there's not too many animals, and you would be constantly monitoring the intensity and the level of the grazing and take the animals off if it was becoming too intense, and depending on the season, sort of weather that year. But again, and it's that kind of keeping everything short outside of that growing period and making sure that the sward is nice and short, ready for the next season. Then the other option, which is more relevant perhaps to the Vale of Glamorgan situation, is managing grassland through cutting alone. And that essentially is replicating these other methods, but just through a cut and collect process. So most of the time, and it's obviously very dependent on each individual situation, but often we recommend that there's a cut at the end of that sort of flowering period around the time that a traditional hay cut would be taken, so around sort of mid to end of July. And then it would essentially be more cuts in between, again, always removing those cuttings, because otherwise those nutrients will just be feeding back into the soil and again feeding those big sort of competitive grasses and other plants like nettles and docks, and essentially just keeping that nice and short in the period outside of the main growth season, so adding in those extra cut and collects to kind of replicate the aftermath grazing or the animals that would be coming in and maintaining it short. So it's essentially how you need to manage species rich grassland. So then I thought we'd just talk about some of the grassland habitats that could be come across in your local area, but also this applies sort of nationally as well. But I have tried to look at national vegetation communities that are specific to Wales. Essentially neutral grasslands, not as common as maybe acidic grasslands in Wales, but certainly there are still some, and they're often more lowlands and again can be species rich, but they can be species poor, which is often more the case that perhaps the management hasn't been ideal for a period of time, and actually just a slight tweak in the management and the species diversity will pick back up again very quickly. Whereas those grasslands that are more modified and have been ploughed and reseeded, if you were to change the management there, it wouldn't necessarily recover in a short time frame. You would probably need to kind of add in species or yellow rattle or something. Often you can get neutral meadows that are false oak dominated, and that usually suggests that maybe the management hasn't been ideal. It could be that the hay cut has been taken late every year, or maybe it hasn't been taken for a couple of years, and that quickly starts to be the dominant grass. Neutral grasslands, it's kind of the most common type for the sort of hay meadows that I was talking about. But again, a lot of whether it's neutral or not depends on the soil type and the sort of geology more than anything else. Often a real variety of grasses. Some species like crested dogtail and sweet vernal grass you can get in the more acidic types of grassland, as well as the kind of calcareous, so they'll be in all types. Whereas and you might get things like yellow oak grass, the bent grasses, fescues, and then the meadow foxtails, often associated with floodplain meadows, Yorkshire fog and the false oak grass. These are all kind of classic neutral grassland species. And then some of the sort of forbs or the wildflowers that you might find would be sort of common knapweed, bird's foot trefoil, yarrow, oxeye daisy, red clover, buttercups, and obviously yellow rattle, particularly in any of those hay meadows. And you can also get sedges and rushes as well. Yeah, not too many of them, because it might suggest that maybe it's a bit wetter if you get lots of them. It is worth mentioning about floodplain meadows, in which case they would have probably more rushes and more sedges and sort of species like ragged robin or lesser spearwort or things like that. and obviously be kind of near to a riparian habitat of some kind. I just thought I would show in a few pictures of some of those common species or sort of the views. So this is a meadow quite close to me, which has those white little frothy flowers in it are corky fruited water dropwort, which is kind of a local kind of interesting plant to the southwest here. I'm based just near Taunton, but we get that a lot. But you might find that you get things like yarrow or something instead of that. You've then got calcareous grasslands, and the word calcareous just means sort of like chalky or base rich. Again, usually more sort of lowland associated, and often can be species rich or species poor. But the calcareous grasslands are usually on the more species rich side. They are known for their sort of real diversity of plant species. They're often on kind of shallow soils, slopes and banks, and often these can be like the remnant parts that are left because, again, machinery couldn't get in and sort of plough them up necessarily. But you can also get these kind of grasslands on post-industrial areas where you've got particularly kind of low nutrients. And obviously it can be associated with the kind of chalky substrates. So anywhere that sort of chalk downland would get these kind of plant communities, but also anywhere that's kind of got sort of a limestone geology or bedrock, that would also kind of influence some of the plant communities like this. They are normally often like managed more by grazing than sort of hay cutting, although there are some calcareous hay meadows found in Gwent, so that's quite an interesting one. And often you can have sometimes grasslands that have got a bit of a calcareous influence rather than they are classically calcareous. They might have some species that are more like that of calcareous, but they've also got a lot of the neutral species. So yeah, there's not always such a clear cut between the different grassland types. Often scrub can be a particular problem when it comes to these kind of grasslands, hawthorn in particular, and that's often what has left these grasslands kind of in terrible condition, is that they've just started to completely scrub over. So often what people need to come in is take out all the scrub and then get animals in there to graze it down and keep it down so that the plants can get established again. But you can also go the other way and you can have areas that have just been completely overgrazed by sheep, and sort of extra nutrients from those animals as well can have an effect. Again, a range of grasses that are particularly associated with calcareous, something like upright brome and the meadow oat grass, downy oat grass as well, and crested hairgrass, all real classic calcareous species. And then some of the other wildflowers you might get could be like salad bonnet, the small scabious, not the field scabious, which we'll be covering today. Things like the perfectly named squinancywort, probably one of my favourite names of plants. Rough hawkbit is often more on the calcareous side, but you can get that in and neutral as well. Anything with like wild thyme, large thyme, and then like carline thistle. And again, you can often get a couple of sedges, particularly sort of glaucous sedge is often found in these habitats. Just showing you some classic chalk downland, where obviously you can quite clearly see the chalk, so you don't really need to see the plant communities to know that it's calcareous. And then slightly more relevant to lots of areas of Wales is the acidic grasslands. And often, unfortunately, they're naturally more species poor than the other grassland types. And often because of extreme overgrazing, they're often even more species poor. The sheep just eat everything, which is a real shame. But sometimes some of the stuff is still surviving. It's just very, very short. They possibly were all originally sort of a dry heath, actually, before the sheep were introduced and started grazing stuff down. And obviously you can get slightly more acidic grasslands that are sort of verging on that acid, but are sort of hay meadows or something. So yeah, it completely depends on the situation. But again, any species that you were to find in the swards that were like sheep's fescue or mat grass, heath grass, wavy hairgrass, they could all tell you that there might be slightly acidic influences. However, you can also get sheep's fescue and heathgrass in kind of calcareous settings. So there's certain species that you will find that will kind of be in the extremes, that either extremely kind of calcareous or the extremely acidic. So it's interesting how some species just seem to like those extremes. And then sort of other plants that you might find that would give you an idea again that you've got something acidic would be something like heath bedstraw, sheep's sorrel is a really good one, tormental. Again, tormental can appear though in the more calcareous areas, and something like heath speedwell. And then there's quite a few sedges and rushes that you also might find in this habitat. I thought I'd just put this picture in because again, it's the acid grasslands that are species poor that end up being amazing for grassland fungi. So this is a site that, I mean, on first look, it's mowed very short constantly. It's pretty much just grasses. There's very little else going on in there. Yet it has got an absolutely astounding array of different grassland fungi. So, you know, it's worth kind of trying to get your eye in on where potentially grassland fungi could be doing good, or repeat visits at a different time of year. So hopefully that's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour over grassland types, meadow management and everything like that. So we'll definitely, you know, if you've got any questions about that, when we have the kind of session at the end, then that will be definitely worth kind of, you know, putting a few things aside if you would like to ask me at the end. But now I thought we'd do some of the more practical things and look at how we can identify some of these really kind of key indicator or common species that you might find in different species rich grasslands. So we're going to go through these, and there are 15, so there's a lot. However, because this is being recorded, do come back and watch it, maybe 3 plants at a time. Go and see if you can find them out in the grassland habitats, and then watch the next, etc. So, you know, don't feel too overwhelmed. And you might find that there's quite a few that you maybe know already, in which case, you know, you're already just reaffirming information you already know. So I thought we'd start with cat's ear, Hypercharis radicata. And it's one of those sort of dandelion lookalikes, I like to call them. And essentially, they are very, very common and in all kinds of grasslands, particularly on lawns. And at the moment, I would say with the lack of rain that we've been having, these guys are popping up everywhere. So after you've mown your lawn, they can kind of send up their flower heads super quick, and they're really tall. And then, so at the moment, with our grass not growing much, these are the only things that are kind of there looking colourful in those kind of parched areas of grassland. But essentially dandelion-esque in the sort of shape of the leaf and obviously that sort of flower situation. However, they are very different from dandelions in a few ways. So first of all, they have very bristly, hairy leaves, which really feel rough, almost like a kind of cat's tongue rough. Maybe they should have been called cat's tongue instead of cat's ear. They also are branched flower heads. So whereas a dandelion has just one stalk coming up and then the dandelion flower head, these come up and then branch into different flower heads. So that's a really key point. But they still start as that rosette of leaves at the base. They also have on their hairless stems, so the leaves are very hairy, but the stems are not. They have these sort of funny little bracts all the way up them. Bracts, by the way, is a term referred to anything that isn't a leaf, but it's sort of leaf-like, because it's not part of the flower and it's not part of the leaves, but it is sort of in between. So that would be called a bract. And essentially, they have these little bracts coming all the way up that are like sort of bracts or small scales that look potentially, with a bit of imagination, like little cat's ears. So that's thought to be one of the things that they think maybe that's why it was called cat's ear. So you can see in this image that you've got a sort of little cat's ear type thing coming up here. It's often darker tinged at the top than it is there, but there you go. So also, like a dandelion, they have what's called a compound flower. So if you're unfamiliar with that terminology, it essentially means that you don't have a single flower on this stalk, you actually have multiple flowers. So each one of these, what looks like just a petal of the flower, is actually an individual flower. So every single one of those yellow petals is an individual flower. And if you look carefully, you can see little stigma and things poking out in between all the folds of those petal-like kind of arrangements. And essentially they have that similar thing to dandelions, that compound flower, dandelion-like. Underneath that flowering head, you've got then more of these funny little bracts sort of all overtopping each other, which interestingly, that whole structure in any of the dandelion family or sort of cousins, is called an involucra, which is a great word. But essentially, the involucra is made of these overlapping purple tipped bracts. And one of the other interesting features about cat's ear is that they have these papery scales in between the florets, which aren't, florets is just another word for individual flower. And you can just about make out that in between these white bits, which are sort of the tube part of each individual flower, there's sort of some other stuff going on in there. And these are basically papery scales in between. So, next time you're out in your lawn, maybe pick one of these and have a real close look at it. The next one looks remarkably like the one we've just done, rough hawkbit. However, there are a few easy, helpful ways to tell the difference, which is useful. So yes, very similar to common cat's ear. However, there are ways to tell them apart. So again, the leaves look very, very similar. It's that basal rosette of dandelion-shaped like leaves, with their sort of crinkly toothed edges, and they're very hairy. They're found in most grasslands, but again, they do like anything that's a little bit more on the calcareous side. But essentially, the main difference from cat's ear that's easy to tell from far away is that that flowering head is on one single stem, and it's not branching out into different ones. And also, generally, the stem and the leaves are hairy all over. However, a word of caution, as the season progresses, and especially in a very hot season like we've had, sometimes some of those hairs can rub or fall off, and you can end up with something that looks lot more like cat's ear than it would normally. This is obviously sort of earlier on before it started flowering, so it's very hairy. But again, that fact that it's one single stem to the flowering head and not branching will also help. There's also another top tip of what you can look at, and that's the hairs on the leaves themselves. So the hairs on the leaves are not simple, straight, single little spiky hairs, but actually little forked hairs that is like a Y shape coming off the leaf. And obviously you can't really see that with the naked eye. So I would say that you probably need to use a magnifying glass or a hand lens to do that. And the best way to do it is to hold a leaf and fold it over your finger, hold it up to the light and use that hand lens or magnifying glass, and you will be able to see those lovely forked hairs if you have rough hawkbit. However, if you do have cat's ear, then those hairs will be simple and not forked at all. And obviously the other thing I was saying is that generally rough hawkbit is hairy all over, whereas cat's ear is generally not hairy on the stem. So hopefully that's cleared that up. And again, just to reiterate, and I've gone into a lot of detail over these two species because, again, telling the difference when you know it is actually relatively simple, but from first glance, you can definitely see how it could be confusing. So this is the rough hawkbit, which has the hairy leaves and the hairy stems. And although you've got multiple stems, they are not branched stems. It's just one single stem that comes up to that flowering head. Whereas in cat's ear, they will definitely be branched. Right, moving away from the dandelion cousins now, over to one of the first pea flowers that we're going to do. So common bird's foot trefoil. So Lotus caniculatus is the scientific name. I should say, I'm a real advocate for using both the common and the Latin. I tend to actually favour the common names because sometimes people's argument is that, well, the Latin names don't change, but actually they do regularly. So, there you go. And also I learnt them all in common names, so I'm just more familiar with it. So yeah, as I was mentioning, it's a member of the pea family. And again, if we want to get technical, the Fabaceae family. And you can see that it's got that classic, what we call pea-shaped flower, in that if you were to look at it, you think, oh, that reminds me of a sweet pea or something. And it's basically got that big banner petal at the back. It's got then wing petals to the side, and underneath it's got what looks like a kind of canoe, which is the keel petal. Another name for this, sometimes quite cute, it's called eggs and bacon. Certainly my gran used to call it that. It's a very popular food plant for many butterfly and moth species. And it's a real common component of most grassland types. Doesn't matter whether it's neutral, calcareous or acidic, this one's very common. It has interesting leaves that are what's called trifoliate. Essentially, that means that it's made up of three parts. We'll get to that. Solid stems, worth mentioning, because there's one that looks very similar to this that's found in wet habitats, and that's greater bird's foot trefoil, and that has hollow stems and is usually more hairy. So one of the easiest ways to tell them apart is just to break one of the stems and you'll see it's hollow. But yes, they have trifoliate leaves. So that means three leaflets, tri for three, foliate meaning leaf. So we've got a three leaflet arrangement. The flowers are yellow, as you can plainly see, but they're often tinged sort of red or orange when they're first coming out. And the buds actually are often almost bright red. So that's why I think it got the name eggs and bacon, because it kind of almost looks two-toned or two-coloured. Being a pea, its seeds are pea pod. And they kind of look a bit like a bird's foot when they're sort of drying. So you can sort of see that from my illustration. And as it's drying and opening, they sort of twist open and then the peas drop out. So yeah, being a pea pod, the seeds are peas. So just coming away from the pea family now and over to the carrot family, so to speak. And this is wild carrot. So yeah, it's a member of the carrot family. Yeah, what a shock. And named wild carrot, Dorcas carota. But this family is also known as the Apiaceae family, but it was previously known as the sort of umbellifers or the Umbellaraceae. Basically, they've moved away from that now. But the idea is that the flowers are always in this sort of like umbel-like structure or umbrella-like structure. So wild carrot tends to form like a little nest-like structure right before it's sort of as it's coming out and opening, but also after it's finished, it closes back down into that sort of nest shape when it's sort of dry and crispy as well. So it kind of is open in the middle of the flowering period, really. And interesting one, I always find this really fascinating about wild carrot is that it's that umbel of many, many, many little white flowers, but in the centre of some, and it's not all of them, there's kind of a little bit of an adapted flower that's weird shape and usually very dark red, almost black, right in the centre. Again, not all of flowers have this, but quite a few of them do. It'd be worth going out and seeing if you can find this sort of example out there. And it's thought that it's kind of looks a bit like an insect is already landed on the umbel, and then essentially that will attract more insects in because they will know, oh, this is a good place to come and feed and land. It's safe because there's already something on there. So yeah, a really interesting sort of adaptation there. So basically most of the flowers that are within the carrot family are sort of very similar. So they're all small white with 5 petals. There are quite a few that are small and yellow with 5 petals, but the majority of them are white. As with a lot of members of this family, the sort of the seeds, the pods, they're really, really useful for identification purposes. And because they're usually quite distinctive and they're quite large, so they're easy to look at. And the seeds of wild carrot are ridged with sort of 4 stout, spiny ridges. So again, another thing that's really worth going out in the countryside for a walk, and if you see one that's finished and it's turned to seeds, or any of the carrot family. So, when hogweed is finished, it's a really distinctive shaped seed. So it's worth sort of picking a few, coming back and having a look at them sort of with a magnifying glass, as they're really interesting. Now, one of the things about this whole family is that we often have lovely frothy leaves down at the base, and then the umbel or the flowering head, so that whole flowering head there, often has, again, is this word bracts again. So they're not leaves and they're not flowers or sepals, but they're these sort of extra vegetative parts known as bracts. And on this family, if they are at the base of the main umbel, they are called bracts. And if they are at the base of the mini umbels, they are known as bracteoles. So just worth kind of getting that terminology in your head and be familiar with it. Now, the interesting things about the bracts, particularly on wild carrot, is that the bracts themselves are what's called pinnatophyid. It's terminology central, isn't it? Don't forget wildflower guides always have a glossary at the back. So if you're never sure what it's talking about in the description, just go and look the word up and it'll hopefully explain to you. But essentially, pinnatophyd means that it's pinnate, which means it's divided sort of into different branches, essentially. And it's not completely pinnate, but pinnatophyd, which means pinnate-like, essentially. And they form this kind of rough underneath and are really obvious. The other thing that's worth bearing in mind with the carrot family is that often you'll be asked to sort of, when you're looking at identifying features, is how many times pinnate, again, that word pinnate meaning divided, how many times pinnate the leaves are. And there's a really useful, simple rule for working this out. And it's essentially that the central point or mark is always 0, not 1. And that's where people can get often a bit tripped up when they start trying to count. So if we use this diagram, essentially something that isn't pinnate at all is something that's going to be completely undivided, and that's 0. If we've got 1 dividing, so 1 times pinnate, then again, we still count that main stem as 0, breaking up into the first division, and this is number 1. So this is 1 times pinnate. The same rule applies here. We count 0, 1, and then we've got another division, so that's 2. And over here, we've got 0, 1, 2, and then we've got another proper division because they divided right down to the midrib, so that's 3 times pinnate. When we look at wild carrot, you can see that we've got the 0 up here. We've then got the 1, and then we've got the 2. And this is where sometimes with a lot of the species, they say 2 to 3 times pinnate. And that's because there sometimes is variability on how much these are divided. So this green one, the second pinnate, essentially some of these are just lobed or toothed, whereas some of them might be divided right down to that central midrib. So that's why it's 2 to 3 times pinnate for this one. Right, we're coming back to our lovely pea family now, meadow vetchling, Lathyrus pratensis. And again, really, really similar to bird's foot trefoil, because we've got a yellow pea-like flower. However, the arrangement of the flowers is quite sort of tall, and it's a much more scrambling plant. It will sort of climb around other things as well. So yeah, scrambling plant. And also the leaves are very, very different. So each leaf is like a pair of lanceolate, that means narrow, oval, and tapers to a point. But the word lanceolate gets used a lot in botanical descriptions. And they're slightly grey-green, and they're leaflets. So again, they are sort of all together, they form one leaf. So you can see here that kind of grey-green colour of the leaves. And they also have tendrils that are obviously there to help them scramble around. And then these things called stipules. So this is also another one of those confusing things about botanical terms, is that, you know, that word bract, we've just got our heads around that. And then suddenly they throw in another word for us, and that's stipules. And essentially stipules are, again, not leaves, they're not bracts, they're not part of the flower. They are sort of leaf-like structures that come out at the base of where the main leaf is coming out. So all of the pea family have stipules, and so does the rose family, etc. And they're really, really, really kind of diagnostic in the pea family. And in meadow vetchling, they are kind of arrowhead shape, which is really nice. And the flowers themselves are kind of in a lovely, what's called a raceme, which is just sort of that arrangement of where they're sort of all stacked up on top of each other on one side. And the flower stalks are really quite long and much longer than the leaves. They are yellow, and they also have pods that are sort of, you know, pod-like. So moving on then to tufted vetch. So again, we're staying in the pea family here, and we've got tufted vetch Vicia cracker, which again, it has that raceme-like arrangement of flowers, but many, many, many more of them than the meadow vetchling, and they're all sort of tumbling down a bit like a waterfall. And these ones are slightly later flowering than perhaps the sort of bird's foot trefoil, the meadow vetchling, which are still out flowering, but the tufted vetch is just starting to come out now, which is such a pretty one as well. Very distinctive trailing purple flowers, as I had. Another one that has a kind of scrambling habit, so it will quite happily sort of grow all amongst other flowers and vegetation, and even in hedgerows and things like that. The leaves, though, are not trifoliate like they were in bird's-foot trefoil and meadow vetchling. They are made up of multiple leaflets. So it's this one here, the larger photo, that is tufted vetch. It's worth pointing out that this smaller photo up here is of a different species called bush vetch. And it's just to illustrate that bush vetch is quite unique among some of the vetches, and it's quite easy to tell it apart because it has more egg-shaped leaflets. It's supposed to look a bit like eggs on a shelf, and that's always a useful tip for remembering it. Whereas the tufted vetch has many, many, many leaflets, and they just look more classic leaf shape, kind of that narrow at the base and narrow at the top and sort of wider in the middle. So yes, leaves formed of multiple leaflets, and so therefore it is what's called pinnate. So again, we've got that 0, 1, so it's 1 times pinnate. It's generally a downy plant, and that means that kind of a lot of hair on the plant, generally all over. And I tend to find it's hairier when it's first unfurling its leaves or just getting started at the end of its kind of tendrils and everything. And the flowers, again, in long racemes. And they've got branch tendrils. So those tendrils are the bits that come out at the end of the leaves to kind of grip onto other plants and help them scramble around. And these branch off into separate parts. The pods are very much like a pea pod, and they are in sort of the same arrangement as that sort of arrangement of flowers, essentially. And the pods, again, release peas, which is lovely. Moving on then to common knapweed, Centaurea nigra. It's also, I think, got another name, hardhead. I've often heard people calling it. But it's, it's a real classic of any kind of grassland habitat. But it is very variable when it's first starting out as a sort of small plant with its leaves. Once it's up and flowering, it's pretty distinctive. But when it's just, little basal leaves, it can be a bit kind of difficult sometimes to differentiate it from some of the other similar plants. It's very roughly hairy, and that means it feels rough to touch. And the stems are very grooved, as you can see in this image, and very hard stems as well, almost feel slightly woody. The flower head is a terminal flower head, and again, it's one of these ones that has these multiple flowers on the end. And people always find this quite astounding when I explain that each one of those individual petal-like purple bits is actually an individual flower going down onto that flower head. So quite an interesting one there. And sometimes you can get them with these extra long kind of outer florets that are really kind of showy and blousy. And often people can then start to mistake it for the greater knapweed, which is the one that's associated with more calcareous habitats. But actually, sometimes there's just randomly common knapweed with these long florets on the outside. It just seems a natural variant. So this is what often a lot of them might look like. So you can imagine if you found one that looked like that and then another one that looked like the picture before, you could easily be mistaken. The lower leaves are stalked, and they're usually unlobed, the kind of basal leaves, whereas the ones that are further up the plant are kind of pinnate-like divisions, but again, not going all the way down to the midrib. And they're kind of oblong to linear or lanceolate. Again, that's that sort of tapering to a point. We learnt that word earlier, the involucra, so that bit underneath the flower head is covered in sort of bristly bracts, which I've got a picture of next. So the leaves of common knapweed, as I mentioned, were really roughly hairy. So I was out in the field recently teaching a wonderful group of surveyors that work for us in our Welsh team. And one of the things we discovered is that we could all identify the difference between common knapweed and devil's bit scabious, which we're coming to later, just by the feel of the leaves. So common knapweed, it's roughly hairy, but it's not, it's just kind of like basically you can feel the difference. With devil's bit scabious feels very different. It's really hard to explain this in a webinar, actually, I just realized. But essentially, if you can go out there and find both species, which obviously we're going to be talking about one of them in a minute, so you'll be able to try and tell them apart, but they really feel different. And when you've done that and you've got that tactile memory of it, you'll never forget it, because it's a really useful trick. Again, just showing you how different then the leaves are further up the plant. And there's that involucra with that kind of bristly bracts underneath. So a completely different one now. This is Betony Botanica officinalis. Not long ago, it was called Stachys officinalis. So if you're more familiar with that, but it changed its name. And it's a gorgeous plant with all these sort of lovely pinkish purple flowers all the way around on the flowering head. And it's really quite a roughly hairy perennial plant. And again, this one you can find on both acidic and calcareous situations, and also in neutral meadows as well. And it tends to be a slightly later flowering species, sort of that June to September time. So can be one of the later ones flowering at the end of the season. And its flowers are essentially comprised of these short, there's like a short oblong whorled spike of flowers. So that whole sort of flowering head has lots of different flowers on it. And you'll often find that they're kind of, some of them are flowering, but the rest of them are just like the sepals. So that word calyx is the first time we come across that tonight. And that essentially is the structure that is formed of fused sepals that contains the sort of base of the flower. And again, another word that we haven't come across tonight necessarily is the corolla. And that is the name of when you've got a complex structure of petals that are fused together to form this flower. So you would refer to this as the corolla and this as the calyx. But essentially, those are the sepals and that is the petals. It's just the way that it's formed in a structure. So the calyx, which are, they are the bristle pointed sort of teeth all over. That's why it makes it sort of that spiky appearance. And the corolla is a sort of red, purpley, pinkish purple tube. And the tube itself is much longer than the calyx that it sits in. So it gives it kind of really long. I kind of like to think it looks a bit like the back end of a balloon dog poking out of the side. So do correct me if you think that that's totally random, but that's just how I like to look at it. And the calyx are those sepals that are joined together. They are sort of two-lipped, but lots of teeth. So the sort of top part has three teeth, and there's two on the lower, and they're sort of a purpley green. But the leaves really, really key. So they form, again, a basal rosette, but often by the time you're seeing it flowering, most of the leaves might have died back a little bit if they've had lots of vegetation around them. But the leaves themselves are quite long stalked, and then they're sort of oblong, and they're kind of coarsely toothed and sort of almost bumpy, crinkly edges. I think they're really, really distinctive once you've got your eye in. The leaves further up the plant, though, aren't stalked. So, but often when you're finding betony, it's earlier in the season, and you can see that basal leaves. There's just some more photos of it there with the pink balloon dog sticking out of it. Moving on to then field scabious, Nautia arvensis. Another one of these ones that's got these multiple flowers on the top of the flowering head, but it's not in the daisy family. I think it's the teasel family. And they, multiple flowers, and it's a very sort of stout, hairy stalk. And then the calyx is sort of formed, it's got 8 little teeth on it. So we're slightly more familiar with the word calyx. Interestingly, you might think that these sort of sepal-like bits that are coming all the way around the base of the plant, and it might think, oh, am I supposed to count how many teeth are there? That's the calyx, surely. But actually, remember, because we've got multiple flowers on this flowering head, each one of those is actually a calyx, and that thing all the way around the outside is what's known as an epicalyx. It's an extra calyx. So again, if you come across that word epicalyx, that's what it means. And then the corollas are these lovely sort of blue violet colour, and they've got 4 sort of unequal lobes, so quite sort of ramshackle in arrangement. You can see one's much shorter than the rest of them, and you've got the sort of stamen and stigma all poking out. And sometimes you can find them in this sort of state, and this is just where some of the flowers in the centre haven't fully kind of opened yet, essentially, and it's giving that almost button appearance. This is one of the individual flowers. Again, you can see how all the petals are fused down into this tube, and so that's where it's often referred to as the corolla. So generally a roughly hairy plant and quite solid stems. The basal leaves are sort of larger and usually unlobed, but still have like blunt teeth on them, as you can see in this image. Whereas the stem leaves go quite deeply pinnatophyd. So there's that word again, where it's got pinnate-like divisions. So it's dividing almost to the midrib. And they're also kind of coarse, hairy segments. And then it has this kind of elliptical end point to it. So it's not divided all the way to the tip. So you can see how it's divided, and then it's got an end lobe, which is slightly bigger. Moving back to our lovely familiar pea family again, you wouldn't believe how many pea families there are in the UK. It's quite astounding. And so the whole plant is generally it's kind of tall and ascending if it's in a kind of tall vegetation, kind of trying to sort of survive amongst lots and lots of taller stuff. Or completely differently, it can be found sort of creeping along the ground and almost in a kind of squat splat type arrangement. So really variable plant. And it's often one of these plants that people will think it's something else. And there's a few little key features that will help you go, aha, right, no, I have got black meadow. So yeah, it's generally a bit hairy, downy. So anything again that's got that kind of trifoliate arrangement, but it hasn't got hairs on it, then it's unlikely to be this. But it's these leaves themselves, the leaflets are toothed, generally all the way around the edge, which isn't in this image, but you'll see in a minute. But it has what's called a mucronate tip. Again, more interesting terminology to learn, isn't there? And essentially what that just means is that you've got a kind of pointy, bristle-like pointy bit at the end of the leaf. And that will distinguish this plant from other things that are very, very similar, like lesser trefoil or hop trefoil. We're coming to hop trefoil in a bit. But we have that trifoliate arrangement. So the flower heads, again, are made up of multiple different little tiny miniature pea flowers, yellow pea flowers, 20 to 40 in a flowering head. And each one of those little pea flowers then turns into a strange, knobbly, kidney-shaped pod, sort of prune-like, and it goes all black, and that's obviously where it gets the name black medic. But before that, they start kind of green, but they sort of go grey-green, and obviously as the season progresses, they go more black, and then it's very, very obvious that you've got black medic. So this is just some pictures of it. So again, it's a bit like the clovers where you've got those multiple flowers on one head. But you can see those individual little pea flowers there quite clearly. They're just on miniature. You can see how hairy the plant is. And that mucronate tip there, you can see just on those leaves. On this plant here, you can see just how the pods are just starting to form here. And it hasn't quite developed properly, but it will get really, really black and knobbly. So the next plant we're looking at is Tormentil, Potentilla erecta. So this is, if you're a keen gardener, Potentilla will be a familiar name with you. There's lots and lots of different Potentillas you can buy at the garden centre. And it's sort of all part of that strawberry-like family. And the whole plant is generally kind of creeping in habit. So it will kind of creep over low ground, but it will also sort of scramble in about amongst other vegetation as well. And it has these lovely little yellow flowers. It's often associated with acidic habitats, but it can be found in more calcareous situations as well. But often if I find Tormentil, I know that there's somewhere in the geology, there must be some slightly acidic influences. The flowers are 4 petals, whereas creeping cinquefoil, which is the same family, Potentilla reptans, has 5 yellow petals. So that's an easy way to tell that you don't have that one. Whereas this has 4, and they kind of have gaps between them so that you can see the sepals in between the petals. They're generally about 7 to 11 millimeters across. The reason I mention the size on these ones is because there are kind of other species like trailing Tormentil and things where you sometimes are wanting to measure the size of the flowers. So generally Tormentil has the smaller flowers than creeping cinquefoil or trailing Tormentil. The flowers themselves are on quite long stalks, and they kind of the flower stalks themselves arise from the leaf axils, which essentially means kind of where the leaf is coming out. I almost like to call it like the leaf armpit area. And the leaves themselves are kind of a shiny, deep green. They're almost hairless above and slightly silky below. They don't have any stalks though, so it's interesting that actually the leaves themselves are these 3 leaflets here. That's one whole leaf, Whereas actually these bits that are coming out either side, it's those old cheeky stipules again. So it makes it look like a whole leaf is there with the extra bits at the bottom. But yeah, 3-toothed leaflets and then 2-toothed or lobed stipules. So they appear to be made up of 5 parts, but technically those 3 bits are the leaves. So this is just to look at it in its kind of natural setting. So you can see quite clearly how you've got these 4 yellow petals, and they've got these gaps between them, and you can see where petals have fallen off. The petals fall off these very quickly, so they don't last long as flowers. And obviously I just wanted to show in this image how they're kind of scrambling and growing in amongst other vegetation. So the other big yellow flower in the centre here is probably bird's foot trefoil, and we've got a buttercup kind of poking out in the corner, but the tourmental is what's kind of covering the ground in between. Moving on then to yarrow, Achillea millefolium. Again, if you're a keen gardener, you might be aware of Achillea. There's some lovely kind of different varieties of this native plant as a sort of garden plant that are often bright pinks or yellows. But this is our native one, and it's always white except for when it's pink. And that's basically where, even in its more native form, sometimes it can have a slightly pink tinge to it or quite pinkish parts to the flowers. So it's not always completely white. It's actually part of the daisy family, despite the fact it looks a bit like it could be in the carrot family with that kind of umbel type thing. But actually, it's not quite an umbel. It's more what's called a cyme. But I won't get into those technicalities at this point. It's strongly scented. I don't really know how to describe the smell, but go find some leaves out in your garden if you've got it, and give it a crush and have a smell. But one that we will find in all grassland types. So the leaves, again, we've got that pinnate. So these are 2 to 3 times pinnate. That means, sometimes it's more divided than others on that final sort of division. And they have these short, narrow, linear segments. The lower leaves are a bit more stalked, whereas the upper leaves are stalkless and a bit shorter. So the flowers, again, we've got composite flowers. So each one of the little flowers on the top is actually multiple flowers. So you've got multiple flowers going into more multiple flowers. It gets quite complicated, but in this kind of umbel-like arrangement. And usually there's sort of 5 ray florets, and then sort of, with teeth at the tip. So if you looked at those, a ray floret essentially means a individual flower that's on the outside of that flowering head around the ray or the rim, and they've got little teeth at the tip of the sort of what looks like a petal, essentially white or pinkish. And the disc florets essentially means, if you imagine, a good example here is common daisy, Bellis perennis, the one that you've got all over your lawn and you used to make daisy chains with. So essentially the white ones that look like just petals are actually individual white little flowers, and the yellow ones in the center are individual little flowers, all those bobbly bits, and each one of those is called a disc floret, and the ones around the outside are called ray florets. And essentially the disc florets on yarrow are kind of an off-white cream, a dirty white. So again, another one to go and look at more detail. So just to give you some photos of it, so you can see here that what looks like a lovely little flower is actually multiple flowers. So each one of those white petal-like structures is actually an individual flower, and then those funny little ones in the center are also individual flowers. And you can see the leaves here quite pinnate, and it kind of is quite downy, and also when it's first starting out, it kind of almost like covered in a sort of soft cotton woolly type appearance. So moving on to hop trefoil now. So we're going back to the pea family, keep kind of coming in and out. I didn't want to put them all together. I thought it would be too many peas all in one go. Trifolium campestre. So the whole plant is sort of sparsely hairy, but the thing that's really distinctive about this plant are its sort of fruiting heads, which are supposed to look like a hop cone. I don't know whether, I mean, it does, but it's not identical. The leaves, again, we've got this kind of trifolia arrangement. So we've got 3 parts to the whole leaf. Each one of these is a leaflet forming the whole leaf. And the terminal leaflet is sort of has a longer stalk than the lateral ones, only ever so slightly, but it is noticeable. And the flowers themselves, again, we've got another one with multiple flowers on the flower head, and they're all pea flowers, but they're quite strangely shaped pea flowers because the standard petal that's normally standing quite up and proud at the back is sort of flat and bending forward and downwards over the rest of the plant. And it's kind of concertinaed as well, which gives it a really interesting appearance. So you can see here in this image how you've got that standard petal that's sort of folded down and curved over, and it's got all these ridges on it, and that keeps that when it's sort of maturing and turning into the seed head. And it's that whole arrangement that gives it that kind of hop-like look. But if you're ever not sure, you know, although it looks like a little bristly tip, it's not technically a mucronate tip on these ones, and you'd have to look at a few leaflets, but it's not black medic. Moving on to meadowsweet, Filipendula ulmaria. So this is part of the rose family. So as I mentioned before, that means we're going to have stipules all over the place. So all these weird little bits in between the leaves are stipules. Generally quite likes wetter habitats, this plant. So you often find it growing in ditches, marshy grassland, and it can generally get quite tall. It can be sort of 120 centimetres or so, and flowers from June to September. So the lower leaves are stalked and pinnate. So again, we're going to use that word again, where it's divided down to the midrib just once, with 2 to 5 pairs. Oh, I've realised I've written Paris instead of pairs there, apologies, of main leaflets. And it's dark green above and sort of hairless, dark green and hairless above, and quite shiny looking. Whereas underneath is real contrast. It's sort of whitish green, woolly, with lots of hairs, a sort of pale green and downy. So it's downy underneath, but not on the top. And then you've got these tiny sort of leaflets or stipules all along, alternate with the larger ones. The flowers, it's kind of a big, tall, frothy display on a sort of terminal stalk above the leaves. And they're kind of in dense but very irregular umbel-like shape. And they are sort of very, very fragrant, creamy, small individual flowers. And then the fruits are crazy. They're kind of these weird, twisted carpels, which just means that the sort of the female reproductive part of the flower are all sort of twisted together in a sort of Mr. Whippy style. So it's quite interesting. So you can see these yeah, frothy white flowers. The frothy appearance really is from the very long filaments and anthers, really. And then you've got the classic leaf with that central red midrib, and then these extra little stipulae leaf parts all the way along. So moving on to Devil's Bit scabious, the one that I was mentioning before. So again, another one part of the teasel family, so the same as field scabious, and it tends to again prefer some of those wetter areas, particularly acid and also calcareous soils. So again, loving those extremes. And it is a later flowering one, June to sort of October. So yeah, one that you can see looking en masse, it can be absolutely stunning and look like an absolute haze of blue. It's quite special. The leaves, they're undivided. So unlike the knapweed and the scabious, most of the leaves are not divided into anything at all, although not always helpful when you've only got a basal leaves of any of these things, because they can often look very, very, very similar. They're generally opposite, oval, lanceolate, that's the general shape, and untoothed, though they're entire all the way around, but they have this very pale central vein, which can often make it quite different from that of common knapweed. And generally the hairs are rougher than knapweed. So this is what I was talking about, the feeling of the texture. So if you feel knapweed, it's generally going to feel softer, and this one feels a bit more like a cat's tongue again. So yeah, quite useful to try that out. The flowering heads are, again, multiple flowers all on the end of a multiple flower head. And the outer florets, so those ones on the outside, are sort of not really any larger than the ones on the inside. So they're all really kind of the same size, although quite often the ones in the middle haven't opened yet. So you get that sort of, again, button-like appearance. And they're a sort of mauve to dark purplish blue, which is quite a different colour to that of scabious, and obviously very different to the knapweed, which is much more sort of pinkish colour. But, you know, it's easier to say that unless you've got them right next to each other. So And again, each floret is sort of 4 or more less equal lobes. So just showing you the pictures of it. So you can see one of the leaves here with that pale sort of midrib. And again, if you were to feel this, it would feel very, very, very rough. And here you've got all of these beautiful flowers with some of the ones in the centre that haven't opened, but a really lovely colour. That is the end of the 15 species, which, my goodness, I don't know about any of you, but I am pooped from just talking about 15 species, let alone trying to get all of that and squish it into my brain. So now is definitely a good time for us to have a really good question and answer session. If anyone has any questions for me, I'd be more than happy to try and help answer them.
Well, we've got a couple of questions that have come in this evening in the Q&A. So I'll just open that up now. And I say if anyone's got any additional questions, do pop it in the Q&A or chat, and we'll try our best to work through. So we have one which will be, I could sort of begin to answer, which is sort of if we've got any recommendations for sort of ID books or use of apps. So I'd say in terms of the what we tend to use in the Vale LNP is we've got in terms of apps, if you're looking to record your findings, there's an app called Lurk Wales, so that's LERC Wales app. It's a free app to download, and it's very easy to use, and what it does, it kind of maps your grid reference location. You can add some images and any information that you know about the species, and then what that does goes off to the kind of National Records Centre for them to verify. But it's really useful to then build, you know, a better picture of the sort of species biodiversity in the Vale. So that's one of the apps that we kind of tend to use. In terms of, I guess, ID specific apps, Sarah, I don't know if there's any that you would sort of like recommend using, or whether it's more kind of traditional ID guides that would be best.
So yeah, I mean, I definitely think, I mean, the apps have gotten significantly better than when they first started coming out. I would always say, you know, a word of caution around using apps first, and that is, you know, I wouldn't rely on them because, you know, although they're very, very good, firstly, it doesn't teach you anything particularly, and you're not going to then improving, you know, but I use them as backup sometimes if I'm like, oh, I think that's what it is, but it would be really helpful to get an app's idea as well. It's almost like a second opinion, really. Or alternatively, especially when I'm abroad, I'm like, I don't even know what family this plant is in. So I need it to help me and get me started somewhere to look up in the book. So it can be really helpful for that. My personal favourite is one called Flora Incognita, which I'm happy to type into the chat. I haven't got the link to it, but if you put that into Google, it will come up. And this is a really, really great app in that it's super easy to use. The accuracy is better than any of the ones that I've tested before, and it stores your observations as well. So if you know, it gives you a percentage of how likely it is to be that plant, and if it's kind of, you know, high 80s, high 90s, then it's almost certainly it, and you can say yes, that is what it is, and it will save that observation for later, and it will give it a geo tag as well. And it is a form of citizen science, so it's a free app, and you're also giving back, which I think is really, really great, and it works abroad as well, so that's always a positive for me. I know other people, PlantNet or Seek is another one. Again, they're all really, really good. So, you know, have a see in which one you prefer. But my personal favourite is definitely Flora Incognita. In terms of guidebooks, though, the one I personally use is the Collins Wildflower Guide, the second edition. Really important because there's quite a few errors in the first edition. But this was probably what I moved on to from what is usually the beginner's sort of one to get started with, which is the Roses Wildflower Key. And this is an excellent book. The illustrations, sometimes not ideal. So if you were sort of picture flicking and looking for kind of an idea of what species you've got, some of the pictures are a bit like, what? That doesn't look like that. But it is really, really good and great glossary, and the keys are really useful. Whereas the reason I moved on to this one, and it's a hefty beast, you know, you've got to have a good back to carry this around, was the fact that it has the grasses, sedges, rushes, and ferns in it as well. So essentially, I only needed this book to take out with me most of the time. So either or, and the pictures in this one are fantastic. I'm really the illustrations are really, really good. So those are my two favourite books. Anyway.
Sorry, I was just getting a link up as well. So I think, yeah, that's great. Thanks, Sarah. And just to add to that as well, what we tend to do is when we are sort of out on our kind of training sessions or surveys, like you say, it's great to have the books. You've got all the comprehensive information, but just as a kind of pocket supplement as well, we do tend to use some of the FSC guides, Field Study Council, and they have kind of grassland plants 1 and 2, and they're just quite good just to, a starting point really, just for some of those kind of more common species that you can find. So I've popped a link in the chat for them as well. But that's great, thank you. So popping back to the Q&A. We've got a question in saying, is it better to try and plant native wildflowers in your garden over the sort of more commercial seed packets that contain various mixes of non-native plants? And do garden wildflower patches have an impact? So I know obviously when we've been talking about meadows today, and sort of, I guess, maybe in a bit more of a landscape scale or kind of larger areas, but I guess in terms of, if you're keen to create a wildflower patch or a small meadow in your garden, what advice would there be if you're going to look at sort of using and purchasing seed?
Yeah, no, great question, and very relevant to what I've been just talking to lots of filmmakers about the last couple of days. So the whole idea that people are looking at their gardens differently, with a kind of perspective of how can I make a little bit of this a bit more wildlife friendly. So we've all been told about putting in ponds and things like that, but looking at your lawn and thinking, actually, I could give over a little bit of this and make it a bit more like a meadow. Sometimes you can be lucky, and this is what I would always advise. If there is a bit of your lawn that you're thinking this would be great to turn into something, is see what's there first, because you'd be amazed at how many times people just give it a break from mowing for one summer and an orchid or something pops up, or just some really lovely self-heal or anything like that. So yeah, always see what's there first. If, however, you know that there's nothing, mainly because maybe it's new turf, or there's you just know that there's not enough there, and you want to bolster it and you want to kind of add things in. So you can either go for the slowly bit by bit approach, which is kind of what I've done with my lawn, in that it kind of had a nice diversity of grasses already, and it had things like the cat's ear, and it had spotted medic and other things in it. But I was like, I want to put some more things in. Rather than trying to seed anything, I decided the most efficient way for me was to buy some native wildflower seed in individual species. So I bought bird's foot trefoil, lady's bed straw, knapweed, etc. And I grew them on as plug plants from seed. And when they were sort of strong enough, I would then plant them in and make sure, just keep an eye on them and make sure that they were doing well. If you do want to do a big area, though, all at once, and you think, well, seeding is going to be the best option for me, then by all means, that's what you can do. But definitely don't buy just, at the supermarket, they're kind of lovely pictured meadow mix, etc., because half the time they don't tell you what's in it anyway. So half, I quite sometimes I like to check out of interest, or what have they included in this? Oh, wait, not telling me. They will often be load of annuals in there, because that's a lot of colour. But again, we talked about that at the beginning. They need constant soil disturbance. A lot of non-natives in those mixes as well. Whereas if you want that real kind of natural look, then you can buy a specific kind of meadow mix that has grasses and wildflowers in it. Emma's Gate are really good for buying seed off. Plantlife do a few of them, as a few seeds as well. Otherwise, there's a website called I think it's British Wildflower Meadows. I'd have to double check that, but it's really great because you can kind of go and look at your area, and they have area specific mixes. So for example, I live in South Somerset. There is a South Somerset mix that's, I know, is taken from a field only 3 miles away from my house. So super local, which is great for kind of that genetic integrity. And if you are going to go down the seeding route, then don't just scatter seed over an already established lawn. It will just, nothing will take. You need to really create some serious bare ground by scarifying it and getting 50 to 70% bare ground before you add in the seed. And then you have to keep that vegetation nice and short, because the grass comes back super fast. So you have to keep it kind of short all the way up until that germination time in the next spring, because autumn is the best time to sow the seed. And then the next spring, when stuff starts to come up, you'd have to make sure before that point that grass is really short. Otherwise, it just shades everything out and nothing germinates. Hopefully that helps.
Brill, thanks, Sarah. And following on from that, we've had another sort of question in terms of recommendations for suppliers. So obviously you have mentioned some there. In terms of for kind of our project work that we do here in the Vale, we also use a supplier called Celtic Wildflowers. So they're based down in the Gower. So they're sort of the most local sort of supplier for us. So we would recommend they do seed mixes. And then, like I said, if we'll have a think, and if there's any other ones that we can think of, we'll pop that in the follow-up email to you with a couple of recommendations. Great. So moving on, we have. So why, in terms of the sort of latter part of the presentation where we were looking at those particular species, so there's a question in terms of why you sort of chosen these 15 species to identify over, you know, any of the others that are available. So is there a reason that these ones in particular are sort of, I guess, indicators for us to look out for?
Yeah, so the list of species was taken into consideration on a few points rather than just one reason. If we were going to go with, look, we're just going to look at indicators as to whether this is a calcareous grassland or this is an acid grassland, then, you know, there are definitely some of the ones that we covered that would be in there, but there'd also be some others that are probably rarer, less likely to come across. So it was a kind of balance of ones that are really going to tell you you've probably got a nice bit of grassland, but also ones that are more common and you're more likely to see. So, for example, something like common knapweed, in itself, it's not really an indicator because you can get it in some less good quality grassland. However, it's also really, really common in lots of great grasslands, so it's a really good one to start to learn. And also, you know, we went back and forth with yourselves as to what likely species you guys might be finding kind of in your local area. So there's no point me teaching you something that only grows, you know, in the north of England or something, because that's just not relevant. So there was a few different factors in choosing those 15 species. And I would say 15 is a lot to do, but as you can kind of go back and watch parts of it, I think, you know, that will help.
Definitely. Oh, thanks, Sarah. So we've got a final question in, which is, so I guess we've touched upon this in terms of we've looked at different kind of management methods, and we've obviously discussed the sort of seeding as well, but we've got sort of, can grassland be restored to become species rich?
Yep, absolutely. So one of the things that Plantlife actually kind of we pride ourselves on is our ability to restore species rich grassland. It really does always depend on what you're starting with to begin with. You know, if you've got a site that has previously been modified and sown with that clover rye mix, then that's fine. We can turn that into a wildflower meadow. We can turn an arable field into, you know, a wildflower meadow. But it's all about trying to get the kind of the nutrient levels down first. So often, because those kind of modified grasslands are constantly fertilized, they have very, very high phosphate levels. So one of the things we always recommend is you come in and you do some soil testing and find out what your baseline phosphate levels are. And if they are anywhere around sort of above the phosphate index of 2, then that could mean that you're going to struggle to establish a really good meadow straight away. If you've got 2 and under, then you can kind of go straight into the restoration. If, however, it's still really nutrient rich, then what we tend to suggest is for the first couple of years is that there's just lots and lots and lots of cut and collect. So you're constantly letting stuff grow, cutting it, taking it off, and you're depriving the nutrients of that sort of grassland, or, you know, and reducing those nutrients down. Once you've got that phosphate level at a more kind of acceptable level, that's when you can start to talk about really the restoration process in full, which we tend to use yellow rattle as a sort of management tool. Because yellow rattle is semi-parasitic on grasses, it kind of reduces the vigor of the grass growing, and therefore instead of becoming this big tall sward of just grasses, it's a bit lower, a bit more open, which then will allow other wildflowers to establish. So ideally you get the yellow rattle in, you get it kind of controlling the grass a little bit, and then you might introduce some other native perennial wildflower seed in afterwards, and then it's got more of a chance. You can introduce both together depending again on those sort of the grass levels and the nutrients, but essentially once you've introduced those things, then it will start growing up, and as long as the management is right afterwards, you can restore species rich grasslands within the 10-year period, which sounds long, but in the terms of ancient grassland that isn't too long. So
Oh, excellent. Thanks, Sarah. So I think that's completed all the kind of questions that have come in. I've just popped a couple more details in the chat for you to have a look over. So yeah, I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you on behalf of the Vale LNP for giving us this presentation. I said lots of inspiration, lots of great stuff to take away and hopefully revisit as we take on sort of creating and restoring our meadows here in the Vale.